I was still in my pajama pants, coffee mug in hand, when I saw a grown man sprinting down my gravel driveway like his soul was on fire. Behind him, one of my crocodiles, Snap, the fastest of the three, slid back into the pond, flicking mud onto the fresh surveyor flags staked across my land like neon-colored weeds. The man? HOA President Carl Whitmore. And he'd just tried to hold an ATV ribbon-cutting ceremony on what he thought would be a new trail through my private property. What he didn't know was that I had legally transformed that trail into a wildlife conservation zone. And Snap? Snap was just doing what Snap does best. The crazy part? This all started because I told Carl I wasn't part of his HOA. And he didn't like that answer. 2 weeks earlier, there were no crocodiles, no viral videos, no deputies investigating rogue bulldozers. It was just me, a quiet guy named Jake, managing my peaceful slice of land just beyond the HOA boundary. The same land my granddad left me and I'd kept the way he liked it, uncut grasses, a little tractor path, and a shed full of memories. I was out back fixing a busted sprinkler head when I first noticed the little pink flags. Dozens of them, lined up like a runway strip across my field. I followed them with a sinking feeling in my gut. They cut across my fence line, through my clover patch, and ended at my well house. That's when I heard it, the sound of smugness approaching in human form. A brand new golf cart rolled up the edge of my property, and sitting behind the wheel in a button-up shirt that practically screamed HOA authority was Carl Whitmore. He adjusted his sunglasses and smirked like he was auditioning for a toothpaste commercial. "Morning, neighbor," he said, like we were buddies. I stared at him. "Can I help you?" I asked, already knowing the answer would annoy me. "Just marking out the new community trail," he replied, gesturing like he was unveiling a national monument. "We got approval last week. Going to be a real treat for the ATV crowd. Cut straight through here." I blinked. "Through my land," I said. "Yeah," Carl nodded. "See, the board voted last month to extend the trail network, and your parcel connects 2 sides of the community. Technically, it's a bit of a gray area, but the master plan sort of includes you now. Just makes sense." "No, it doesn't." I pulled out my phone and showed him the property appraisal and boundaries. My land was clearly outside HOA jurisdiction. Always had been. My address wasn't even listed in their registry. Carl just waved it off. "Oh, that? Yeah, small hiccup. We're working with zoning to fix the lines. Honestly, it'll be cleaner once we're done. Let me get this straight. You're claiming I'm in the HOA now because it's convenient for your trail?" Carl smiled again. "It's progress, Jake. Some people just don't get it until it's built. You'll see. Once it's running, property values go up, we all win." That's when I realized what this was. Carl wasn't just being annoying, he was being strategic. He was trying to steamroll me into compliance by acting like it was already a done deal. I told him in no uncertain terms to remove the flags. He didn't flinch. "See you at the community meeting," he said. "We've already allocated budget for it." The next morning, a small bulldozer and a few landscaping trucks were parked near my fence. My old shed had been knocked sideways. One of the workers said he was told this was HOA property now. I called the sheriff. Carl was there when they arrived. He pulled out paperwork. The sheriff frowned, said it looked suspicious, but that it was a civil matter unless I had camera footage of them trespassing. Carl gave me a wink. "Guess you should install cameras, neighbor." That night, I sat on the porch with my old friend Ray, a retired military guy who lived down the road. I told him the whole thing, from the flags to the bulldozer. He sipped his beer and muttered about HOA people being their own breed. Then he laughed. "You know what would freak them out more than lawsuits?" he asked. "What's that?" I said. "Crocodiles," he said, deadpan. "Put a few in a pond, call it a wildlife sanctuary. They'll never set foot there again." I chuckled, then paused. "Wait, could I do that?" I asked. Ray raised an eyebrow. "You're asking the guy who used to build camouflaged bunkers for a living. I think we can manage a pond." Turns out I could do it. I stayed up late researching local wildlife laws. The answer shocked me. If I registered my lower field as a reptile habitat and provided fencing and signage, I could claim conservation protections. And crocs? Legal in this state with proper permit. Non-breeding, imported, controlled environment. I barely slept that night. The next day, I visited a local herpetology center and got more than I bargained for. Not only could I legally bring in crocs, but they had 3 older ones that needed a home: Snap, Crackle, and Pop. The logistics were tricky, but with Ray's help and a few calls to an old environmental consultant, we began converting the low ground into a proper wetland zone. I filed paperwork with the state. I built fencing. I installed cameras. I laid out signs that said wildlife habitat, do not disturb. Carl drove by a few times and sneered, assuming I was just stalling. He had no idea what was coming. By the time the crocs arrived, I had the permit nailed to my gate. The delivery truck driver looked at me like I was insane, then handed over the documentation. Ray cracked open a cold one and toasted me. To the only man in the county who fought the HOA with prehistoric monsters. Carl's official trail launch was scheduled for the weekend. He invited the board, some residents, and even hired a photographer. What he didn't expect was for one of the board members to lean too far over the fence trying to take a picture. That's when Snap lunged. The guy screamed. Papers flew. Carl fell backward into the photographer. The woman's purse landed in the mud. Chaos exploded. And me? I stood a safe distance away, arms folded, sipping my coffee. That was the moment Carl realized he hadn't just lost a trail. He'd started a war. One he was wildly underprepared for. And Snap? Snap was just getting warmed up. The Monday after Snap made his public debut, the HOA group chat leaked. Leah, my niece who lived inside the HOA's jurisdiction and had joined their social page just for recon, forwarded me the screenshot. Carl had gone nuclear. His messages were a frantic string of half-baked legal threats, bold claims about unauthorized wildlife, and a demand to eradicate the swamp nonsense before it spreads. One message simply said, "We can't let a single man stop a $40,000 community investment." That one made me laugh. Not because of the money, but because Carl still believed this was a matter of budget and board vote. He hadn't yet understood that this wasn't a neighborhood squabble anymore. He was trying to run a political campaign against 3 federally permitted crocodiles, and I had the law on my side. I spent the day finalizing my next move. I submitted all the required documentation to the state's conservation department to have the pond officially listed as a protected habitat. A local ecologist came out to inspect the site, asked a few questions, took photos, and left looking satisfied. It helped that I kept the place clean and safe. The fencing was secure, the crocs well-fed and not aggressive unless provoked. I even added a few tall reeds, floating logs, and a solar-powered water fountain for aeration. The goal wasn't just to scare Carl. It was to create something that no bureaucrat could touch. Ray helped me reinforce the east fence with reinforced panels, in case anyone got brave, or stupid, enough to try something after dark. Leah, meanwhile, kept the social media angle going. Her clip of Carl tripping into the photographer had already hit 20,000 views. But the comments were what really mattered. Dozens of locals were now rooting for me. People who hated the HOA's overreach or had similar stories were tagging their friends and spreading it like wildfire. Some said things like, "Finally someone stood up to them," or, "I would pay money to see that trail flooded with gators." The attention wasn't just entertaining, it was insurance. The more people who knew what Carl was trying to pull, the harder it would be for him to cover his tracks. But Carl wasn't giving up. On Wednesday, he returned with a clipboard and a man in a suit. They parked outside my gate and pretended to measure things. I didn't say a word. Just stood next to the sign that read Reptile Sanctuary, authorized entry only. After 10 minutes of fake measuring and pointing, the suit approached. He introduced himself as a community liaison from the county's development office. Said he was here to review concerns raised by the HOA regarding your recent landscaping modifications. I told him to hold on and fetched my permit folder. 30 pages of state and county paperwork later, his tone shifted. When I reached the page with the wetland registration, his face did something I'd seen in courtrooms before, a quiet mental retreat. He closed the folder and nodded politely. "Looks like you've done your homework," he said. Carl fumed silently behind him like a deflated balloon. That night, Ray and I set up additional cameras and motion-triggered light. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Carl had the look of a man who wasn't used to losing. And men like that always escalated when their bluster stopped working. Ray installed a few tripwires that triggered harmless sirens, just enough to alert us if someone came through the brush. We weren't setting traps. We were building a legal wall of proof in case someone trespassed again. 2 days later, the HOA tried a different approach. They hosted a community cleanup day, and conveniently picked a plot near the edge of my property as their gathering point. I knew what this was. An excuse to get people close, maybe snap some photos, spread a rumor that I was dangerous or irresponsible. But they weren't ready for what happened next. A drone buzzed over the pond just as Snap surfaced. The croc glided silently toward the center, eyeing the object in the sky. Crackle followed behind him, more sluggish but curious. Pop stayed buried in the reeds, as usual. The drone hovered lower, too low. With lightning speed, Snap launched upward, jaws wide, and snapped at the air. The drone spiraled downward and crashed into the water. A cheer went up from a group of teens watching from the trailhead. Carl, standing nearby, turned ghost white. Leah got the whole thing on her phone. She added it to her growing playlist titled HOA vs. Crocs and posted it with the caption, "When HOA drones meet real predators." The video reached 100,000 views by morning. That same day, a local reporter showed up asking for an interview. I declined politely, but I let them film the outside of the property and gave them a copy of my permit. The story aired under the title "Man Turns Land into Crocodile Sanctuary After HOA Overreach" and painted me as a folksy underdog standing up to authoritarian neighbors. Carl was quoted but came off as petty and evasive. It was perfect. That night, Carl made his next move. I caught it live on my camera system. Around 2 in the morning, a figure crept along the eastern fence line wearing a hoodie and glove. The tripwire triggered a silent alert on my phone. I tapped Ray, who was napping in the guest room, and we both moved fast. Out the door. Lights on. Sheriff called. By the time we reached the back fence, the figure had slipped through a small gap in the brush and tried to run. Ray used a spotlight to blind him mid-sprint. The guy tripped and fell into the muddy edge of the pond, just a few feet from Pop's favorite resting log. The sheriff arrived minutes later and arrested him for trespassing. We later confirmed he was a local contractor who worked occasionally for the HOA. When questioned, he claimed he was just checking the drainage. The sheriff didn't buy it. Carl, when confronted the next day, denied knowing anything. But the timing was suspicious. And now, with an arrest made, his credibility was slipping further. The HOA board held an emergency session, but internal leaks from Leah revealed panic and division. Some board members were furious that Carl had dragged them into a legal mess. Others wanted to resign entirely. By the weekend, I'd turned the east side of the pond into a full educational zone. Added benches, a few laminated facts about reptile conservation, and even a donation box with a handmade sign that said "Support Local Wildlife." People came by, took pictures, asked questions. Kids pointed at Snap with amazement. The whole thing had taken on a life of its own. The funniest part? I hadn't set out to do any of this. I just wanted to be left alone. But if Carl wanted a battle over control, then I was going to win it with brains, legality, and a few scaly friends who didn't care about property values. I wasn't just protecting my land anymore. I was defending the idea that someone couldn't be bullied into submission by a group with too much money and no boundaries. And the crocodiles? They were thriving. The following Monday began with a letter shoved through my gate, tucked inside a plastic sleeve and zip-tied to the post like some cheap ransom note. It was on embossed HOA letterhead and had a ridiculous red watermark that read, "Formal Notice of Violation." I laughed out loud before even opening it. Ray was feeding the crocs with a bucket of thawed fish when I waved it in the air and said, "Guess Carl's got a new hobby, paper threats." The letter claimed that my crocodile pond posed a community safety hazard, violated unspecified zoning expectations, and demanded immediate removal of non-compliant exotic species. It ended with a bold threat to pursue aggressive legal remedies. What it didn't include, of course, was a single reference to an actual law. I scanned it into my computer, emailed it to Marla, my lawyer, and poured myself a second coffee. I knew what Carl was trying to do. He wanted to scare me into backing down before the HOA board completely collapsed. What he didn't know was that Marla used to be a prosecutor, and she lived for cases like this. Marla called back within an hour, laughing so hard she snorted. She told me to relax, and that not only was the letter completely unenforceable, but Carl might have just handed us a harassment claim on a silver platter. She was already preparing a response, one that included all my legal permits, my registered conservation status, and a timeline of Carl's trespasses, threats, and drone-related antics. She even included screenshots from Leah's videos. It was a masterpiece. By noon, she'd served it to the HOA board directly. That was the first real crack in their wall. A few members started contacting me privately, saying they didn't support Carl's actions, that they were unaware of the extent of the legal mess, and that they were considering stepping down. One of them, Janet from the landscaping committee, even apologized for the bulldozer incident, saying she'd been told I had agreed to it verbally. That lie alone told me Carl had been spinning a fantasy from the start. Meanwhile, the internet wasn't slowing down. Leah's second video, Drone vs. Crocodile, Guess Who Wins, had crossed 500,000 views. People started tagging news stations, wildlife pages, and legal advice forums. Someone even edited the footage into a fake movie trailer called Swamp Justice, with dramatic music and fake cast credit. I couldn't walk into the hardware store without someone asking, "You the gator guy?" Ray found it hilarious and started printing homemade t-shirts that read Team Snap in camouflage lettering. We gave one to the sheriff, who wore it during his next visit just to mess with Carl. It didn't take long for that image to start circulating too. The HOA's reputation was now fully in shambles. Carl, for all his bravado, was watching his empire melt into a laughingstock. So he escalated again. A few days later, an officer from Animal Control showed up at my gate. He was polite, professional, and clearly uncomfortable. I offered him coffee, and we sat at my porch table while he read from his clipboard. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint about dangerous unregistered reptiles and improper fencing. I handed him my entire documentation binder without saying a word. After half an hour of reviewing, walking the perimeter, inspecting the pond, and even tossing a fish to Snap just for fun, he sighed and said, "I don't know what these people are trying to pull, but you're in full compliance." He shook my hand and added, "Frankly, this is the cleanest sanctuary setup I've seen in this county." He even took a photo for his department's bulletin board. Carl must have lost his mind when the report came back clean. 2 days later, HOA members received an email announcing an emergency vote to discuss reorganization of leadership. Leah forwarded it to me with 10 laughing emojis. From what I gathered, several board members were demanding Carl resign or face removal due to legal liabilities. The message claimed Carl was jeopardizing community harmony, and a few homeowners even started circulating a petition. I stayed out of it publicly, but privately, I smiled every time a new update rolled in. I didn't need to push anything. Carl was burning himself down, one bad decision at a time. Still, I knew he wasn't finished. People like Carl didn't know how to admit defeat. When public image failed, they went underground. Which is exactly what he tried next. That Friday, I got a ping from my camera system around 3 a.m. Ray and I were both up. We had started taking shifts ever since the last contractor was caught. This time, we saw a flatbed truck parked a quarter-mile down the road, near the access gate that hadn't been used in years. 2 figures moved toward the fence, one with bolt cutters. I didn't even bother with a flashlight. I used the speaker on my camera and said, "Smile for the sheriff, boys." They froze. The motion lights kicked in. Ray fired a warning shot into the air, not at them, just enough to make a point. They scrambled back over the fence, tripping and falling. Within 5 minutes, the sheriff pulled up. One of the guys was Carl's cousin, a low-level contractor who'd been banned from county jobs for poor ethics. The other? A teenager from the HOA community who confessed everything. They'd been instructed to break the lock and dump fertilizer into the pond to kill off the gators. When asked who instructed them, the teen hesitated, then dropped Carl's name. Carl denied it, of course, but between the footage, the confession, and the pattern of escalation, the sheriff had enough to press charges. Carl was served a temporary restraining order the next morning. The HOA board officially suspended him. His access to funds and authority was revoked pending investigation. Local news ran the headline, "HOA President accused of Crocodile sabotage." By that evening, the meme community had created 100 new versions of Carl being chased by cartoon reptiles. One even had him photoshopped into a swamp boat with the words, "Retired HOA President of the Bayou." It should have felt like the end. But I knew better. Carl's reign might have been over, but the cleanup was far from finished. Lawsuits were already flying. Homeowners were demanding refunds for misused dues. Contractors were claiming unpaid invoices for the failed trail project. And I, somehow, had become the unwilling symbol of resistance. Still, I didn't regret a thing. The pond had become more than just a defense. It was now a feature. Families came to visit. I partnered with a local school to host biology field trip. Even a scout troop showed up to ask if they could help with signage and conservation efforts. In just a few weeks, I'd gone from annoyed landowner to community conservationist. All because one man thought his board badge gave him dominion over someone else's land. I didn't set out to be a hero, but if standing my ground meant exposing abuse, protecting wildlife, and giving Carl a healthy fear of reptiles, I could live with that. Snap, Crackle, and Pop didn't mind the fame either. They basked in the sun, fat and happy, like royalty surveying their kingdom. And from my porch, I watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction, already wondering what Carl's next desperate move might be, and ready for it. It was barely past midnight when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and the soft whir of a machine engine in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another curious neighbor trying to peek at the croc pond, something that had become more common since the viral videos. But as I stepped out onto the porch with my flashlight, I saw something bigger. Through the tree line, the silhouette of a bulldozer appeared, its headlights cutting across the tall reeds like searchlights in a war zone. My gut dropped. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a curious teen or HOA board member trying to get footage. This was Carl's last move. He'd hired someone to destroy the pond and everything I'd built, and he was doing it under the cover of darkness. Ray had already jumped into his boots by the time I shut the door behind me. We didn't say a word. We both knew exactly what this was. The cameras had picked up movement, and the automated alerts had been sent straight to both our phones. I grabbed the tablet that controlled the camera feeds and saw a second figure approaching from the opposite side, clearly meant to be a lookout. They were wearing dark clothing and carrying bolt cutters. Ray muttered, "So this is how they want to go out." I nodded and texted the sheriff, already on speed dial at this point, and hit the panic alert on the security app. That triggered the tripwire sirens and the motion floodlights. Lights so bright the whole east side of the property lit up like a prison yard. The bulldozer froze as soon as the beams hit it. The driver, clearly not expecting resistance, threw the machine into reverse, but the tires hit the soft edge of the pond berm and got stuck in the mud. He tried again, but the treads only dug deeper. Ray and I moved quickly, one toward the driver and one toward the second intruder. As soon as I got close enough to the bulldozer, I shouted for the driver to step out with his hands where I could see them. The man did not look like a professional contractor. He looked like a desperate cousin with a rented machine and a bad idea. He raised his hands and muttered something about just doing a job. I told him he'd be doing time instead. Ray had already caught the second guy by then, who'd tripped in the mud and was half covered in wet clay, swearing and trying to wipe his hands clean on a hoodie with the HOA logo stitched across the front. The sheriff arrived less than 15 minutes later. He didn't need much explanation. Between the trespassing, attempted property damage, and clear video evidence from at least 3 angles, both men were arrested on the spot. The driver cracked under pressure and admitted Carl had paid him cash with no paperwork, promising it would be just some dirt removal. The other guy, who turned out to be Carl's nephew, tried to play dumb until the sheriff showed him the infrared footage from the cameras that had caught his face in full detail. It was over. At least, that part of it was. Carl, of course, denied everything. When the sheriff showed up at his house later that morning, Carl put on his fake politician's smile and claimed to know nothing about the incident. Said it must have been a rogue act of community frustration. The sheriff wasn't buying it. He informed Carl that he was under formal investigation and reminded him that a restraining order was already in place. Carl made the mistake of asking, "Do you know who I am?" To which the sheriff replied, "Yeah, a guy about to lose a whole lot more than a trail." Later that day, I received a knock at the gate, not from a troublemaker this time, but from a reporter with a local news crew. Word of the overnight attack had already spread through neighborhood chat groups, and thanks to Leah's quick posting, the footage was now circulating online. The reporter asked if I'd give a statement. I agreed on one condition: they show the full footage and not just the drama. I wanted people to see the lead-up, the security measures, the legal signs, and the reckless attempt to destroy a protected sanctuary. They agreed. That night, the segment aired under the headline "Crocodile Sanctuary Targeted in HOA Sabotage Scandal." The response was electric. The footage showed Carl's relatives fumbling in the mud, the bulldozer stuck at an awkward angle, and Ray standing calmly with a spotlight like he was guarding Fort Knox. The community response was instant. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, not just without Carl, but specifically to vote him out entirely. Leah texted me as the votes came in, one by one, in real time. By a margin of 12-1, Carl was removed as HOA President, stripped of all decision-making authority, and hit with an internal motion to have him reported to state HOA regulators for misconduct and financial misuse. But the best moment came 3 days later, in court. Carl, now facing civil and criminal action, tried to file a motion against me for emotional distress and unfair social media targeting. He claimed the videos had defamed his character and caused irreparable damage to his reputation. Marla showed up with a massive binder of evidence: permits, videos, chat leaks, community statements. Then she played the drone footage, the trespassing attempts, and the bulldozer incident, all in front of the judge. The courtroom snickered when Snap appeared on screen lunging at the drone. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, dismissed Carl's claim with prejudice and suggested that he might be the one owing damages soon. After the ruling, reporters outside asked Carl for a statement. He shoved a camera away and stormed off without a word. Meanwhile, I got handshakes from strangers. Some thanked me for standing up to the HOA, others asked how they could start their own sanctuaries. One woman offered to sponsor a croc feeding event for her son's birthday. I declined that one, but I appreciated the support. By the end of the week, things settled into a new kind of normal. The east side of the pond, once a quiet patch of overgrowth, now had a viewing deck donated by a local woodshop class. A handmade sign welcomed visitors and explained the story of the sanctuary, how it began as a response to HOA overreach and turned into a symbol of peaceful resistance. Kids came by after school. Teachers brought classes. And snap, crackle, and pop? They took it all in stride, basking in the sun, occasionally flicking mud at the fence if someone got too close. Ray and I sat on the porch that weekend, watching a family take pictures from the gate. He handed me a cold drink and said, "You know, I never thought gators would fix a neighborhood." I nodded and replied, "Sometimes it takes a prehistoric bite to shut modern bullies up." We clinked bottles and looked out at the pond. There were no more bulldozers. No more flags. Just peace. And Crocs. The sun was just starting to dip low behind the trees when I heard the crunch of tires rolling over gravel again, but this time it wasn't a bulldozer or a drone truck. It was a minivan, clean and quiet, pulling up near the gate with a magnetic sign on the door that read Hometown Weekly. Out stepped a woman with a clipboard, 2 cameras strapped over her shoulders, and a wide-eyed intern trailing behind her. They weren't here for scandal, lawsuits, or confrontation. They were here to do a feel-good follow-up story. That's when it truly hit me. This entire ordeal had gone full circle. What started with survey flags and HOA threats had turned into something people actually wanted to celebrate. The Crocodile Pond wasn't just a quirky protest anymore. It had become a symbol of standing your ground, of outsmarting bullies with the law and a bit of muddy creativity. As the reporter asked questions, I took her on a short walk along the reinforced fence, pointing out where we'd installed wildlife cameras, added new vegetation, and set up educational signage. Kids from a nearby elementary school had helped design laminated posters with croc facts and silly cartoons that now hung proudly near the viewing deck. Snap surfaced mid-interview, popping his head up like he knew he was being watched. The intern gasped and grabbed a shot just as Crackle glided through the reeds in the background. It was perfect timing. The reporter asked how it all started, and I told her plainly, one man tried to take something that wasn't his. So I gave nature a home instead. She nodded, scribbled something down, and smiled. This might be one of my favorite stories we've ever covered. Once they left, I returned to the porch where Ray sat in his usual spot, working on his latest wood carving. He was making a sign for the west side gate, something big and bold that read Croc Kingdom, EST. After Carl. We both laughed the first time he said it, but now it felt oddly fitting. The community had started calling it that anyway. People who had once ignored this patch of land were now bringing their families here. There were no fences being cut anymore. No drone buzzing in from above. Just birds, reeds, the occasional splash from a croc flipping over in the shallows, and peace. Pure, quiet, and well-earned. Carl, on the other hand, wasn't enjoying the same kind of peace. After the court's ruling and his removal from the HOA board, he'd tried to file for an injunction to block further footage of the pond from circulating. That backfired when the judge reminded him he'd already been caught committing and facilitating multiple acts of trespassing and sabotage. His name had become synonymous with petty tyranny online. A popular podcast had even done an episode called Gators vs. HOA Tyrant, and Leah told me Carl's house had been quietly listed for sale just 2 days after it aired. Apparently, he couldn't walk to his mailbox without someone yelling "snap snap" from a passing car. But karma had one more gift for him before he packed up. A non-profit legal advocacy group, the kind that supports property owners in HOA disputes, reached out to me after reading about the case. They asked for permission to use my story as part of a public education campaign. I agreed. Within a week, posters went up around the state titled, "Know Your Rights. Even gators deserve a habitat." My face was on them, next to Snap with his jaws half open. It was ridiculous and kind of hilarious, but it worked. People learned from it. They started asking real questions about property lines, HOA overreach, and how far too many boards operate unchecked. For once, bureaucracy had been beaten with nature, patience, and a few clever tricks, and that made all the madness feel worth it. I expanded the pond slightly that spring, adding a shallower shelf area to give the crocs more room and keep the waterline cleaner. A local nursery donated plants. A small scout troop came to help with remulching the outer trail. Someone even painted a mural on the side of my old tool shed, a massive, cartoonish snap wearing sunglasses and a gold chain that read HOA Slayer. It was absurd. But I left it up. Why not? It made people laugh, and that laughter had chased out a lot of bad memories. The sheriff, who had become somewhat of a regular visitor since the incidents, stopped by one afternoon just to check in. He leaned against his cruiser and looked out at the pond, watching Crackle flop lazily onto a mudbank. "You ever think you'd end up running a sanctuary?" he asked. I shook my head and smiled. "I thought I'd just grow some alfalfa and get old quietly." He chuckled and tipped his hat. "Well, I'll tell you what. You've done more good for this place with 3 crocodiles than Carl ever did with his board meetings and bylaws." Ray and I held a small gathering a month later. Nothing fancy, just a barbecue with some neighbors who had supported me from the start. People brought sides, chairs, lemonade. A few brought cards thanking me for standing up and keeping the pond open. One elderly couple said they'd lived here 20 years and never felt like part of the community until now. That stuck with me. For all the trouble Carl caused, he accidentally helped create something real. Something lasting. As the sun went down that evening, I watched the water shimmer gold across the surface of the pond. Snap and Pop floated like shadows under the reeds, while Crackle slowly circled the middle. Ray handed me a fresh drink and nodded toward the handmade sign hanging from the gate. It was simple, rustic, and perfect. "Sanctuary of the Stubborn," it read. I grinned. "You think he's still watching the videos?" Ray asked. "Carl. Yeah. Probably. But at least now, when he does, it's with the knowledge that no matter how hard he tried, he never got that trail. And instead of wheels tearing up the grass, he got scales in the sun." Ray raised his drink. "To scales in the sun." We clinked glasses and sat there as the last light faded. I didn't need to win awards. I didn't need a medal or a speech. All I ever wanted was to protect what was mine and be left alone. And now, finally, after bulldozers, drones, lawsuits, and a few near misses with teeth and mud, I had exactly that. My land. My peace. My crocs. And not a pink survey flag in sight.